It's great to be here today to talk to you about this great project and great natural area recently purchased by the Illinois Audubon Society. Talk about the rare plants and the vascular flora of the Illinois Audubon Society's Round Pond Sanctuary. These are my colleagues and collaborators on this project, Eric Ulasik and Dave Ketzner. Both Eric and Dave are former graduate students of Dr. Molenbrock at SIU and have been great mentors to me over the years. They are two of the very best botanists in the state of Illinois. Here's a quick snapshot of my professional volunteer affiliations. I'm a botanist at the Natural History Survey, campus of the University of Illinois. Been active with the Endangered Species Protection Board's ASTAC committee, as well as the Native Plant Society and other organizations. I'm also active on various social media platforms, Sedge on iNaturalist, Olive's Plants on Instagram, and on Facebook I'm an administrator for the Midwest Graminoids group. So here's the Round Pond Sanctuary. You can see it's located far southeast corner of southern Illinois here in Pope County, just a few miles from the Ohio River on three sides. Here's a map that shows the coastal plain. It's important for this project. You can see that the coastal plain extends up the Mississippi Valley and just barely reaches the southern tip of Illinois. John Schwegman's Natural Divisions of Illinois map. You can see at the bottom of the state the coastal plain natural division. And a little closer look here in brown at the very bottom of the state is the bottomland section of the coastal plain natural division. The green just above that is Cretaceous Hills section. This area of the state is the northernmost extension of the Gulf Coastal Plain province in North America and northernmost extent for a lot of species and plant communities, including the bald cypress tupelo swamps in the area. The climate's warm and humid here. In midsummer, this area is no joke hot and definitely difficult field conditions. The bottomland section is basically a broad floodplain at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The Ohio River on the eastern edge and southern edge of the state, and Mississippi, of course, on the west edge of the state. It's mostly forested with floodplain forest, terrace forests, and of course the bald cypress swamps. The soils here are mostly recent alluvium, but the terrace soils also are older and hard pan clays, and that'll be important as we talk about the Flatwoods communities later. There's a distinctive flora and fauna in this area. We talked a little bit about this is the northern extent of the bald cypress swamps, and definitely the northern extent for a lot of southern species, both animals and plants. The bottomland forests of this area also are interesting, very diverse with a number of different oak species. You'll see in our Flatwood site we had a great diversity of tree species, especially oaks. Here's a little closer aerial photo of the Round Pond Preserve. You can see bounded in the red outline here. You can see a large swampy area at the northeast corner and north side, and then a slough swamp cutting through the site, through the entire center of the site, as well as a small swamp area at the southeast corner. These will all be referred to later. Just to the north is the TNC's Round Pond Nature Preserve site, approximately 206 acres. Encompassing a large part of the actual Round Pond swamp at the north end of the Audubon site. And then overlapping both of those is the Round Pond Illinois Natural Areas Inventory site, which is approximately 650 acres. And you can see now with the purchase that Audubon made in 2018, nearly this entire INAI site is protected. This is a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. A lot of the presentation will be focused on the plant communities and the rare plant species that we were able to observe on site, but I also wanted to give some information and sort of guidance on different resources and references that we use to conduct these floristic inventories, so that other folks that hope to do this on their own sites will have some good idea of places to go for information. ILPIN, or the Illinois Plant Information Network, is a great site to go to get some basic information about species for project area. I like to use this to get lists by county. You can see on the right side of the website, you can get species by county. And if you put in Pope County, you find out that there are 1,372 plant species known in Pope County. Pretty diverse county. Also, the Illinois Indigenous Species Protection Board site is a good place to go to identify various endangered plants and animal species that are known from the county. And Pope County is has one of the highest numbers of endangered species, 56 threatened and endangered plant species. As of the 2015 list, changed a little bit with this recent 2020 update. One of the best pieces of information that we had about round pond was the information from the INEI inventory back in 1977. Max Hutchison first evaluated this site, and the field forms were dated March 15, 1977. At the time, the natural area was estimated at 540 acres. See the round pond swamp outline. This is the INEI site, so the southern part is Audubon property as well, but outside the INEI. Max graded the swamp, mapped out the plant communities, and gave quick descriptions of each of the plant communities, as well as a little guidance on what the dominant species were. In his report, Max stated that round pond is a medium to high quality swamp on an old lake terrace instead of alluvium, and may be the only sizable swamp of that type in the coastal plain. And we'll talk about that a little more later. This is sort of a unique swamp and definitely worth protection. We did a search for herbarium records. I was able to search the Illinois Natural History Survey database as well as some of the online portals for specimens. We were able to find 17 specimens of 10 different species. They were all collected by John Schwegman over a 34-year period starting in 1970. John collected 3 of the state-listed species. We were able to find specimens for Crabapple, Crabapple decomposita, and Stachys americanis. Also noteworthy, he made some collections of Hydraulia and Flora, which at that time was probably considered to be a pretty rare plant, still restricted to southern Illinois and one of the most iconic species in the state. We'll show some images of that on site later. The specimen scan here on the right is Sparganium androclatum, which is a species that we weren't able to relocate in our work at the Audubon Society Preserve. We did find a sterile Sparganium that potentially is this species. But I should also point out that, especially given some of the age of some of these specimens, the early ones especially, the location information, pre-GPS information, the location's not as detailed, and they might be more likely to have occurred on the TNC property to the north. We received this figure from Audubon Society after we initiated the project. Locations of the rare plant species across the area. This was really helpful to us as we started to plan and prepare for our study. We also received some additional information from Jeannie Barnes of the Illinois Natural Heritage Database. We've had the great pleasure of working with Jeannie on several projects over the past 15-20 years, and she's retiring soon and will be missed by us and of course by many. Stream Stats, another good resource to use. Gives you some information about hydrology, what the watershed areas are like, and you can kind of get some information about where the water is coming onto the site as well as where it goes from the site. You can see the match line here, the Pope and Massac County boundary line, which is just to the west of Round Pond. It's interesting here that Round Pond is kind of a terrace site, and it's sort of a headwaters site, and that the water on site at the north and east parts of the area, they drain to the northeast to the Ohio River up near Hamletsburg, Illinois, while the west and southern part of the site drains to the Ohio River over near Brookport via Mud Creek. Web Soil Survey, they mapped 15 soil units on the site. These 5 are the ones we're most interested in. These comprise about 85% of the area of the Audubon Round Pond Preserve. You can see the top soils, these are all the swamp soils, frequently flooded soils. And then at the bottom, the two flatwood soils, especially the Gannat 7460A, which is in most of the flatwoods areas on site. This is a really nearly level site, rarely flooded, but has a high water table. It's a silt loam over silty clay loam over silty clay, so it has a sort of a clay pan, these older terraced clay pan soils. We were able to get some historic aerial photography for the site, which is really informative. You can see actually that Round Pond has recovered quite a bit from past disturbance. In the 1938 aerial photography on the left side here, you see large areas that were cleared for agriculture, for row crop agriculture. A lot of areas north of the east-west slough were totally cleared of vegetation. Some of the ones south of the slough, of course, are still open agricultural fields that just started reverting back after the Audubon purchase. Another area to note here is this at the southwest corner of the preserve. You can see on the 2019 photo, it looks like pretty mature forest. 1938 though, a large part of that was pretty scattered trees, so really open forest. You can see a pond here at the southeast corner of that block. Likely a stock pond, and then you can also see some trails, probably from cattle, in that site. So that western part of the Round Pond Preserve was likely grazed. The Round Pond Sanctuary was visited throughout the growing season of 2019. Vascular plant species recorded on each visit and primarily identified in the field. However, when we encountered difficult to identify or interesting specimens, we did make some collections for future deposit at the Natural History Survey. We conducted 7 3-day survey trips. You can see they're roughly monthly from April to November. In addition, we also had 3 single-day visits or partial day visits, including this May 25th visit, where I joined some sedgeheads from the Southern Chapter of Native Plant Society for Sedgepalooza on site. During that visit, we were able to record, I think, 25 different species in just a couple hours. So a great time. Each of these visits, there were at least two botanists conducting the searches. We mapped plant communities, located and mapped rare plant locations and invasive species locations as well. Here's the Round Pond Preserve, TNC site to the north. These are the 3 sort of swamp units that help orient you to the site. The Round Pond Swamp in the northeast corner, east-west swamp in the center, and the small willow maple swamp here at the southeast corner. During these 3-day visits, we conducted a meander search where all plant communities in all areas of the property were visited. Day 1's a shortened driving day, and surveys were conducted in the southeast corner of the property, trying to hit all the community types in this area and recording species in that area. On day 2, which was a long full day, surveys occurred throughout the north half of the property, from the east-west swamp to the boundary with the TNC property, meandering back and forth between this swamp community and the Round Pond Swamp, recording species in both those communities as well as the flatwoods between. By the end of the day, we would cover the entire north side, rounding the southwest corner of the property and the flatwoods, and then following the road, Unionville Road, back to our starting point. Day 3 is another shortened day, as would be our day to drive back home. We'd cover the remaining area in the southwest corner of the property, mostly a flatwoods community, but also a wet meadow community, pond, and some other cultural, former agricultural fields that are succeeding. After each visit, each species was assigned an abundance rating: abundant, frequent, occasional, and rare. We did this in 3 different ways: overall, by community, and also abundance for each visit by date. And this last way especially is important to help pinpoint the times that are best to survey for rare species. When are they most observable? Rare species and invasive species as well. We conducted a floristic quality assessment using the CC values from Taft et al. This assessment provides a measure of floristic integrity or degree of disturbance for a site. It can be useful in monitoring. And last, we also graded and classified the communities based on information from White et al. 1978 and IDNR 2017. Overall, we were able to record 619 total taxa. You can see the major groups here. Lots of species, interesting species that are more southern species, not found in the rest of the state. Things like the climbing dogbane, Thercenthella deformis, really attractive vining species you see in southern Illinois. Swamp dogwood, Cornus femina, closely related to more common Cornus racemosa. And very rare both on site but also in the state is the Trichocarpus thusi, the white nymph, a rare Apiaceae or carrot relative. You can see the most represented families, the big three. These are the big three in any floristic inventory really in Illinois and throughout the Midwest, the grass family, sunflower family, and sedge family. 1/3 of all the plants that we recorded were in these three families. The genus Carex, of course, is the largest genus in Illinois and the largest in this study as well, with 44 representatives. We were able to record actually 32 just in the Flatwoods community alone, which is a pretty high number. We found lots of rare species, 10 state listed species in all, plus one that had not been seen for many years. We'll talk a lot more about those later. Here's our plant community map. You see the codes, the three swamp areas, the Round Pond Swamp here at the northeast corner. Again, our Slough Swamp, the east-west swamp that cuts through the center of the site, and the Willow Maple Swamp at the southeast corner. We had 6 different communities, 5 natural communities. That will be the ones we most talk about. Really just 3 of those we'll talk about in detail, and then also some examples of cultural community, wet meadow, a pond, and successional fields. This is a summary table of data for the various community types at Round Pond. It's a little bit busy, but I think it works okay in this type of format. I'll try to focus you in on some specific areas. You can see here above the red line are the natural communities on site. 5 different natural communities. Below are the cultural. The area of those, you can see that the southern flatwoods, especially in swamp, those are the 2 predominant communities that are present. I'm going to talk about these 3 natural communities in the remainder of the presentation. These are the higher quality areas. I'm not going to talk too much about cultural communities, but I will point out that they do have a lot of species, 405 species, including 303 natives. Cultural communities shouldn't just be ignored, and because they are actually important for a couple reasons. They can be a place where invasive species take hold and spread into the natural communities, but they're also a refuge for native species, and in some cases called conservative native species. You can see 44 conservatives in this community type. Overall, the mean C was 4.1 and the FQI 87.7, really high numbers. And this can be used as a baseline for comparison as the site is monitored over the years. Likewise, mean C and FQI for the natural communities are all high scores. We'll point out here the table has 588 total species. We actually recorded 619. The difference here are about 30 species don't have a C value from Taft et al., so it couldn't be used in the analysis. First natural community we'll talk about is forested swamps. See, the Round Pond Swamp and the east-west swamp have a similar composition. Both of these sites are dominated by the same 2 species, bald cypress and Tupelo gum. Less frequent tree species include the red maples and Drummond's maple, swamp cottonwood, and others. Well, the willow maple swamp at the southeast corner, it's a smaller area, and it does have some bald cypress trees and tupelo gum. It's largely dominated by younger black willow and red and Drummond's maple. Overall, the forested swamps had 221 species, mean C of 4.7, and FQI score of 66.4. There's some important differences between the round pond and east-west swamp. Even though they both have the same dominant species overall, there's a lot of key differences. Talked earlier on about the round pond swamp is actually a terraced lake swamp, and is different character than most other swamps in Illinois. The east-west swamp is an alluvial swamp. It's a slough that runs through the site, and actually even has some flow early in the season. Other important differences are the east-west swamp actually had a lot more species, even though they're similar in area. East-west swamp had almost twice as many species. It's largely due to the shape and the nature of the site. So the east-west swamp is a very linear, really long linear site with lots of edge. The water level fluctuates greatly, and because of that, there's a lot of edge community where it fills in with grasses and sedges and forbs later in the season. The round pond swamp doesn't have nearly as much edge. As I mentioned, it's a terraced lake swamp, and it's influenced by groundwater. When you walk out in the swamp, it's very likely spring fed. The water is pretty cold even in the heat of summer, and I think all of these things sort of are reflected on the vegetation here. One other difference, since the water level doesn't fluctuate as much in the round pond swamp, if you see on the bottom right picture, each of these trees, there's a ring of vegetation around the base of each of these trees. You don't see that in east-west swamp, where the water level fluctuates tremendously. We'll talk more about this later, but you can see these buttress spaces on the bald cypress and tupelo gums are important habitat for other species. This bald cypress is grown about 2 feet of water. They do need a drawdown. You can see these seedlings, they need a drawdown to germinate, produce new plants. But these are good habitat for a lot of species to grow, and a good place to look for some of the rare species. Here's Biden's discoidea, grows on the buttress bases, one uncommon member of the genus Bidens, and Tridenum waltri, which is a lot of them on this photo here, and also here on the side, the state endangered cypress knee sedge. In all the forested swamp communities, Houghtonia inflata, the American featherfoil, is present and fairly abundant. Overall, we had it as occasional, but in the swamps, it's actually pretty frequent. Such an iconic plant species, one of the most interesting and amazing wildflowers that we have in Illinois and really in the eastern U.S. Early in the year, it's sort of an aquatic plant underwater with these feathery leaves, and then as it gets ready to flower, the stems inflate and pop it up above the surface of the water so that they can flower. Here's a timeline that talked about our abundance and seasonality of the species. You can see the April 29 to May 1, that's when it was actually blooming, so it's kind of occasional then. Then it kind of quickly drops off. Quickly after flowering, the stems deflate and it sinks back down into the swamp and is pretty difficult to pick out for a little while, and then basically disappears completely almost until conditions are right. If their conditions are right that year, the water subsides, new plants will germinate from seed from that same year, and those we were starting to see especially around August and through fall, and those will actually stay around through wintertime and be the plants that will bloom the following season. We had a lot of rare plant locations. In all, we found 60 locations for 10 state listed species plus 1 location for a formerly extirpated plant species. You can see they're scattered throughout the site, but a lot of them here, this figure shows, a lot of them are associated with the swamp, the forested swamp community. And in the forested swamps, we found 7 state listed plant species, plus the 1 rediscovered plant species. Crabapple and Crabapple decomposita are two of the endangered Carex species that we found in the swamp communities here at Round Pond. You can see Pantherclavileta on the left. It's a sectional-vales sedge, difficult group taxonomically, characterized by the gynecandrous spikes and then the flattened winged paragenia that you see at the bottom in the center. Carex decomposita, the cypress knee sedge, it's almost its entire habitat at this site in Illinois is at the base of bald cypress and tupelo gum trees, as you see in the photo here. The ring of moss layer just seems to be perfect for the achenes, and when you zoom in on that a little bit, you can just see all the little seedlings that are found. Both these species are southern species. Pantherclavileta is a coastal plain species with some disjunct locations in the southern Great Lakes, which is a fairly common pattern. Carex decomposita, its distribution pretty much follows the distribution of bald cypress, although it does extend in the northern part of the United States where it grows off of the trunks of buttonbush and buttonbush swamps. We found the Arkansas managrass, Glycera arkansana, in one location along the east-west swamp. It's a difficult species to identify, especially in the field, and often lumped in with Glycera septentrionalis. You can see with this image of the florets from Florida, North America. This is one, since we had to identify it back at the lab, we don't know the total distribution of the species on site, and more work we needed. Hydraulia uniflora, the one-flowered Hydraulia, was a new species for me from this project. You can see when the site's inundated, the leaves are floating to the surface of the water, really glossy looking. As they draw down, you can see that they form these little colonies, little patches that are sort of weakly ascending plants. We found several small patches of them with about 150 total stems, mostly areas that are like 3 feet by 3 feet. Across the road, across Unionville Road to the south, we saw about 250 plants in one area. We first saw it on September visit and came back in October, totally missed it in bloom, but we were able to find some fruits. So likely late September is probably the best time to see the blue flowers on this species. It's pretty distinctive vegetatively though, even if you don't find the flowers or fruits. The glossy leaves and then these stipular thorns, it's pretty easy to identify. Pantherclavileta, the wood orchid, it's a species that's rare in Illinois, but another species that's found in northeast corner of Illinois as well as in the southern corner of Illinois, previously also already known from Pope County. This one we found on a really hot day in July, and I was just bent over, just taking a breather along the edge of the east-west swamp, put my hands down on my knees just to take a quick breath, and I looked down and I saw these little plants with their small white flowers. The whole plant's only about a foot tall, so they're really a small orchid, and they kind of are hidden within the emerging vegetation at the edge of the swamp. So especially some grasses and sedges sort of hiding in amongst the Carex tripuloides. Difficult to see. We found a total of 15 stems of it in an area about 6 feet by 10 feet, and that was all we saw on the entire site. There's lots of suitable habitat. Again, it's a small plant and difficult to see, especially in the vegetation. Searches should be conducted in July when it's blooming. It's most likely time to actually observe it. Stachys americanis, another of the rare species we found. This is a shrub, kind of a large shrub. During our May visit, it was just loaded with flowers, just a striking shrub with lots of white flowers. Beautiful to see. It was pretty common along the edges of the swamp communities, just kind of scattered along there, but not unusual to see. It has a really characteristic bark. It's a multi-stemmed plant with lots of smooth gray stems coming up. The leaves don't look fairly ordinary, not unlike a lot of other shrub species, maybe confused with spicebush and Virginia water spire, Itea, but if you quick look with a hand lens, and you'll see the stellate trichomes that are characteristic of this family, the Styraceae. We found this species at a lot of places along the swamp. It was really sort of scattered along, and a lot of those were small and sterile plants. But one location I'll talk about later had 1,000 stems or more, and just a spectacular sight in bloom. Next, we'll talk a little about the shrub swamps. We found two different types. The 3A in the top left is a Styrex dominated shrub swamp, and then 3B at the bottom right is a buttonbush shrub swamp. These shrub swamps, you can see the two photos here, the Styrex swamp at the top right and the buttonbush swamp in the bottom left. They have similar structure, shrub dominated communities. The Styrex shrub swamp has an exceedingly high mean C value, 5.3. That's a very high mean C value. FQI of 37. That's partly just because of its really small size. It's only a couple acres in size. 51 species. Almost all were native. I think maybe 49 of those were native species. This site's dominated by American Styrax. We did a count through the site with 3 people, and we were able to record, I think, around 750 stems, 750 plants actually, so clumps that were over a meter high, and then another additional 300 or 400 that were under a meter. So more than 1,000 plants, well over 1,000 stems. And this is a place to go in mid to late May when they're blooming. It was just spectacular. Here at the south, at the bottom left corner, is the buttonbush swamp. You can see dominated by buttonbush, but there are a lot of shrub-sized tree species, including red and Drummond's maple. Also, bald cypress and the tupelo gum are pretty common. This site, on some past photography, and you can see in the site there are some downed trees in here, and appears to be the result of maybe a blowdown or that's opened this site up to become a shrubby area for a while, but it'll likely go back to being an extension of the bald cypress swamp over time. Southern Flatwoods, you can see here on the map, the number 4 community type. It's the most abundant community type in the preserve, with about 180 acres. Really interesting community. Sort of a mosaic of wet and dry, sort of blended together. These flatwoods are pretty interesting. They're really diverse sites. As the name indicates, they're really flat communities. Just a few inches really affects the plants that are on site. They're really wet in the springtime and tend to dry out in the summer as the summer goes along. The diversity of species is really high, partly because of these low areas adjacent to higher areas, sort of a mosaic of back and forth. So there's a combination of dryland species and wetland species, sort of intermixed and growing side by side. At this community type, we were able to record 15 different oak species in the Flatwoods community. A really good diversity of oak species, from wetter species like pin oak and swamp white oak. Cherry bark oak was a really common plant in these sites, and then the drier species like black oak and white oak even, and post oak were pretty common across the site. The depressions were characterized largely by grasses and sedges, especially sedges. Iliacus verrucosa is kind of a characteristic species of these sites, and I'll talk a little bit later about Iliacus Wolfie, which is a sort of an unusual sedge that is found in these areas. Here's some of the rare species we found. This is Cherixin tumescens, the greater bladder sedge. We found this, I think, at 10 sites across the preserve. Here in the middle, you can see this is the Illinois botanizer, Crispinda. This is during our INPS Sedgepalooza event. Intumescens is an interesting plant because it's state endangered, but we're starting to pick up more records. But the population sizes are generally pretty small, so not real large populations. And the same is true here. Over the entire site, I think we found it at like 10 locations, a total of 93 plants. Scepteridium bitornatum, the southern grape fern. This is one I was really excited about. Site. I've done a lot of surveys in the past for this species in southern Illinois, and most of the records that we have in Illinois are really small populations. Usually when I would see them, most of the plants would be sterile, just a handful of plants, and most of them would be sterile plants. But at one location here at Round Pond, that's totally different. You can see a bunch of them just in this one spot, but we found one location with more than 200 fertile stems, sporophores, and greater than about 300 sterile plants in the population too. So a population of about 500 or so plants. It's just amazing to see. This species co-occurs with more common Scepteridium dissectum, but the sporophores emerge a bit later in the year, and it's a noticeably smaller plant, less dissected, and the segments of the fronds also are kind of more sharply toothed on the edge, I think, than dissectum. But until you see them kind of close together, it can be really difficult to get a good handle on the identification of these. Two other really rare species that we found, both state endangered, the southern crabapple, Melis angustifolia. We only found one tree of this. We're probably a little late doing our surveys. The species flowers really early, and that's the best time to see it. And likely it's going to be more common kind of at the edge of these flatwoods communities, or the edge of the habitats. So even just a drive-by, you might find some additional trees at the preserve. Willow oak's another one. We only found a handful of willow oaks. I think multiple sites, but just a few at each one, and most of those were shrub size. We did find one tree of a willow oak and pin oak hybrid, Quercus extrachiana, grown in the flatwoods on the north side of the property. Iliacus Wolfie is another one, and I mentioned this one before. This is a species we found in the southern flatwood site at the southwest corner. This species, for a long time, was thought to be really rare. Prior to 1978, there were just a little over 50 records across the eastern United States. You can see on this NatureServe map in the top left corner, it's considered critically imperiled in nearly every state that it occurs in. But recently there's been a lot of effort. It was a former candidate species for federal listing. There's been a lot of effort to locate this species, including in Illinois, where Dr. Rick Philippi at the Natural History Survey was able to document the species throughout Illinois, and now we have almost 50 records across the state of Illinois. I'd mentioned Iliacus verrucosa is kind of the characteristic southern flatwoods spike sedge. That species has a rounded stem, actually multi-angled. It's 5 or 6 angled, so that if you roll it, you can roll it between your finger and thumb, and you can actually feel the angles on Iliacus verrucosa. See this photo at the top right. The wolf spike sedge is quite a bit different. It's very wide and flat stems. They're twisted and blue-green in color, so really easy to identify, really, even vegetative. We found about 6 locations within the same flatwoods. Each of the spots were only small colonies, about 2 feet by 2 feet. So not a very abundant plant on site, but it was a really nice one to see. I saved the floating mat community for close to last. It's one of the more exciting spots that we found at Round Pond Preserve, and something that is really unique vegetative-wise in the state of Illinois. You can see some of these photos of the floating mat community. You see it's pretty densely vegetated. It's an opening within the cypress swamp, within the bald cypress swamp. It consists of organic matter that's basically held together by the extensive root systems of the sedges and grasses and the shrubs and forbs, and kind of anchored in by small trees. You can see on the far right here the bald cypress. There's some small bald cypress trees and tupelo gums and red maples, things like that. So it has enough integrity that it can actually hold up these small trees. But I suspect over time, as the trees get larger, that it'll be too much weight, and they'll eventually it'll sink this floating mat, and it might be sort of an ephemeral feature. We only found one example of this on site. I'll talk a little bit later, but I hope to be able to get out there and look for some more at some point. This is what it looks like. This is a video we took of the floating mat. You can grab these small, shrub-sized trees and bigger trees even, and just kind of pull them. The soil layer, it's floating. It's approximately a foot or more thick with roots and sort of loose soil within that over the water layer. This water in this general area is about thigh high to waist high in depth. It's a place where there are a lot of cottonmouth snakes, especially this area, but really the whole site, all around pond. There are a lot of snakes everywhere. One day we recorded, I think, 24 different snakes, and most of those were cottonmouths. They can be really abundant, and they really like this sunny opening in the middle of the swamp. As I mentioned before, this site it's in the Round Pond Swamp, which is the Lake Terrace Swamp, and seems to be spring fed. Probably relates to the origin of these floating mats. Wasn't able to find out too much about them. I haven't seen anything like this in Illinois, but they're apparently in Arkansas. They do occur in some near permanently inundated lake swamps that sound similar to Round Pond. On this swamp, the greatest secret of the site was Ledwidgeus pheocarpa, the Round Pond Primrose willow. This species hadn't been seen in more than 160 years, last seen in 1860, and we were able to rediscover it. I think we first saw it in July 2019, and we kind of knew what it was, but it took us a while. We had to wait for some fertile stems and flowers and fruits to totally verify the identification. These are the only two specimens that we know of for Illinois. Both are at the Field Museum in Chicago. The one here on the right, you can see one of the characteristic features of the plant is this inflated base. It's kind of a spongy, peely, inflated base. And we saw that in July, and I pretty much knew what we had, but I really wanted to wait until we had some fertile material to verify. We were able to find 5 plants that first year. I think a total of maybe 16 stems, something like that, not too many. Did go back again in 2020 to look at it. It's a pretty sensitive area, this floating mat. It doesn't have enough integrity that you can walk on it. So we don't go out into the center of it. We really only poke into the edges where it's kind of loosely consolidated anyway, where the interface with the mature trees in the bald cypress swamp. But in 2020 we were able to locate some additional plants. I think we end up with 16 or so plants with 51 stems site. So we do have a nice small little population. And you can see here the distribution map. This is another coastal plain species, more restricted to the southern coastal plain, and those Cook County specimens and the other ones, it's another of these disjunct coastal plain species that are found in southern Great Lakes. So we're really happy with the work that we've been able to do at Round Pond. We think we've created a pretty good list of plant species, lots of rare plant locations, and and information on invasive species. And really, the work is just beginning for the Audubon Society as they continue with this site and management efforts. Lots of prescribed burns probably help the Flatwoods communities and especially invasive species control. This site's a little bit different in that it doesn't have a horrible problem with shrubby invasive species. A lot of sites in Illinois, Amur honeysuckle and autumn olive and some of the other shrubs are the worst invaders. There are very few of those actually, of those two species, but these three, the Japanese chafflower, Japanese honeysuckle, and Japanese stiltgrass are really bad problems on site and are of the most concern to the natural communities here, especially the Flatwoods communities. The Japanese chafflower, Acaranthus japonica, is a relatively new species, both for Illinois but also in North America. It wasn't found in North America until 1981 and quickly spread down the Ohio River Valley, and now we're seeing it throughout the southern Illinois portion and starting to move up a little north, I think, too. So one that we really need to hit hard before it becomes firmly established and creates a seed bank that really will be damaging to our natural areas. The series of photos here on the left are all three Acaranthus japonica. The one top left is a plant in early April, what it looks like, and then kind of going into summer, looks a little sort of like a Ruellia or something like that, and then later in the summer it flowers and fruits and has these fruits that have sort of bristly bracts that will latch onto your clothing and animals' fur and can easily transport it from site to site. A real serious problem. The Japanese stiltgrass, Microstegium biminium, another really bad problem in the Flatwoods communities, especially some of the Flatwood sites. The southwest corner one, which is the highest quality Flatwoods on the site, has Microstegium biminium, but it's not yet a really bad problem in that area. Some of the other areas, really large patches, 100 or more feet across, and by the end of summer you just see it smothering out some of the quality vegetation. Real bad problem in southern Illinois and expanding every year. Melis japonica has been a bad problem for a long time and is abundant in the Flatwoods communities and the edge of the swamp communities. It's another species to be concerned with. In the future, we'd like to continue some inventory work here, looking for rare plant species, and especially focusing on the TNC property. I'm going to try to contact some folks with TNC that I know, and maybe with the INPS Southern Chapter, and do some searches for additional floating mats and looking for the Ludwigia and hopefully finding some more populations of that on site. So with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I'll take any questions.